Hello, welcome to your second part of cell transport and homeostasis. And so now we're going to talk about active transport. So we talked about passive, and remember, you have a quiz over passive coming up. And remember that passive transport is the passage of substances through the cellular membrane without using any energy. And so now we're going to talk about active transport, which requires energy. After you are done with this video, you should be able to identify the difference between active and passive, explain how different types of active transport occur, and outline the role of cell transport in homeostasis. So how does cell transport help with homeostasis? Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about active transport first. And so I've kind of already stated that active transport occurs when energy is needed for a substance to move across a plasma membrane. Remember, the usable energy for a cell is known as ATP. So this energy that is required to move substances across the membrane is ATP. Substances moving, and the reason why energy is required is because substances are moving from low concentration to high concentration. So remember, passive was from high to low. Now we're talking about active, which is from low to high. So it's kind of like if you are moving uphill, it actually takes effort to move yourself uphill in comparison to going downhill where you have gravity helping you, so there's not as much energy used. And just like with with passive transport, there are different types of ways active transport works. And so the first type of active transport is known as a sodium-potassium pump. So an example of active transport, like I said, is the sodium-potassium pump. So you would probably assume that this involves sodium and potassium, and you would be correct. So when this is in operation, and a lot of times the sodium-potassium pump is used for muscle contraction, used for the nervous system. So a lot of functions when you're talking about sodium and potassium, those particular ions. So when sodium ions are pumped out of the cell, and potassium ions are pumped into the cell. So that is what this pump is used for. So you're kicking out sodium, you're bringing in some potassium. And to do this and to use the least amount of energy, the cell uses these pumps in two different ways. So this pump can work both kicking these sodium cells or ions out and taking in these potassium ions. So both ions move from areas of low to high concentration, which I've already talked about. And what's really going on is that you have a certain amount of sodium ions, and more particularly, you have 3 sodium ions. Once you have those, they bind with a carrier protein. Quick reminder, carrier proteins, remember, they carry things, they move things across. It's like a piggyback ride. So carrier protein binds with 3 sodium ions, and this is occurring inside of the cell. Those carrier proteins receive energy from ATP. Once the energy is received, the carrier protein changes the shape, allowing 3 sodiums to leave. While this is also happening, this is another sign for, okay, now 2 potassium are going to bind, and those on that same carrier protein, those are going to be brought in. And I'm going to draw a picture of this because I feel like this is a little confusing. But basically what you need to know is 3 sodium go out, 2 potassium come in. This is with the help of the sodium-potassium pump. So if you're not sodium, if you're not potassium, then you're not affected by this type of pump. Okay. Again, I will go over this in class and I will show you a picture of what this looks like. Remember though, your carrier proteins changes the shape, and this allows for transport in and out of the cell. Next type of transport we have is known as vesicle transport. And you probably remember when we talked about vesicles, and these are like these little packages sent off from the Golgi apparatus that send out of the cell and send around to the cell. And so now we're going to take that and we're going to apply it. So this is when we have really, really large molecules that really just need that extra help. And so some molecules, things like proteins, those are incredibly large. And they have very, very complex structures that it's just hard to pass them through the plasma membrane without some kind of assistance. So vesicle transport is even more assistance. So remember, you had your carrier proteins. They don't require energy with passive transport. But when you got things like proteins, they just need a little more help. So they need energy And they need these vesicles, these large bubbles, if you will, that carry things in and out. So no matter what, and no matter their concentration, they require just a lot more help. So very large molecules cross the plasma membrane with a different sort of help called vesicle transport. Vesicle transport requires energy, so it is also a form of active transport. There are two different types I'd like you to know about: endocytosis and exocytosis. Remember, the word endo indicates in, exo indicates out, exit. So we're going to go into detail on those two types of vesicle transport. The first type of vesicle transport is known as endocytosis. And endocytosis is a type of vesicle transport that moves a substance into a cell. So we're coming into the cell, into the cell. And you can almost think of this process as like swallowing or taking in. So what's going on is the plasma membrane completely engulfs or bites into or swallows a substance. So a vesicle pinches off from the membrane. So it engulfs it, vesicle pinches off, and the vesicle carries the substance into the cell. And again, I will draw these pictures. I'm not the greatest artist, but I'll work on it. So like I said, you have the plasma membrane, and you have this very, very large substance. The plasma membrane essentially swallows the substance. It pinches off into a circle, so it's not interacting with the photo or phospholipid bilayer, and then it comes into the cell. There are two different types of endocytosis. One, when the entire cell is engulfed, so when you have an entire cell that gets taken over by another one, this is known as phagocytosis. And when it just a fluid is engulfed, this is known as pinocytosis. So a couple of things to distinguish between the two. And really, like I said, all it is this just, it takes in the material, pinches off, and comes right in. Now, when we exit the cell, this is done in a little bit of a different process, similar but different. This process is known as exocytosis. And so we're still doing that pinching off process, but it's just a little bit different. Exocytosis, again, is a type of vesicle transport that moves a substance out of the cell. Again, this requires energy in some way. A vesicle containing a substance moves through the cytoplasm. So remember, we're going out, we're exiting. Exocytosis moves through the cytoplasm to the cell membrane. So it's making its way on out to the exit. Once this occurs, the vesicle membrane, so that tightly packaged package, fuses with the cell membrane. So it's almost just like leaning against the door, and it's like, hey, I'm here. And then the cell membrane figures that out, and it releases that substance out. So that vesicle just touches the membrane, and then it becomes a part of it, and eventually that's what releases out. So the substance that's inside, and a lot of times this has to do with waste and different types of energy and other sorts of things like that. A lot of times has to do with waste. Now, coming back to the idea of survival and how this is all related. So a lot of you are like, okay, yes, this is a part of the cell. Why is this important to us? Well, if we couldn't transport in and out of a cell, the survival rate of a species would be very, very non-existent. So in order for the cell to function normally, a stable state must be maintained. Remember, everything is trying to reach equilibrium. So in order to do that, we must have a balance of salts, nutrients, other substances. So everything wants to be up that nice teeter-totter balance. Both passive and active transport play a vital role because they transport in and out vital nutrients, waste, energy, all of these things super important for the cell. So without passive and active transport, the cell could not do its job. It could not function. So those are the examples I've given. Hopefully when we talk about this in class, it'll make a lot more sense. If you have any questions, please, please, please ask me on Edpuzzle.